to have so many people from, again, across North America and overseas. We're excited that you're here for our session 2 of the Human Trafficking Intervention Training Series. Today's presentation is a case study on the Victor Rax case out of Utah. Today's training is in collaboration with Christie House, Equitas, the Office of the Attorney General, State of Utah, and Giant Slayer Consulting. My name is Nathan Earl. I'm your host today. I serve as the principal consultant at Giant Slayer Consulting, where I provide training and technical assistance to organizations and communities to prevent violence against boys and men. You can learn how we do that at giantslayer.us. Today's training is also partially underwritten by Christie House Children's Advocacy Center based out of Miami. Founded 27 years ago and focused on child sexual abuse, they now treat all types of child trauma. They coordinate a multidisciplinary team of 8 agencies coming together around cases from across Miami-Dade. The Project Gold Bridges to Futures program, which is who's partially funding today's training, is focused on girls and young women aged 12 to 22. They utilize a survivor-advised, victim-centered approach to operate drop-in centers in home-like settings, again, across Miami. Some of the services they offer include enrichment, life skills and recreational groups, therapy, support groups, leadership training, and related programs, and again, funded by a Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. We are honored to have 2 thought-leading pioneers within the movement today, 2 subject matter experts, really. Jane Anderson, who is an attorney advisor with Equitas and a former human trafficking prosecutor from Miami, Florida. And we're also honored to have Josh Kalis, who is a special agent with the Utah Attorney General's Office and was the lead investigator in the Victor Rax case. Before we turn it over to our experts today, just a couple of housekeeping items. So everyone knows the webinar is being recorded. If you do have any tech issues, direct message me, Patricia, or Sybil. As we go through, if you have specific questions that you'd like addressed during or after the presentation, please remember to utilize the QA box, not the chat box, because those are very likely to get lost. But please feel free to add comments and to continue networking into the chat box. And then finally, certificates of attendance will be provided to everyone, to all attendees today. So Josh and Jane, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting us to be here today. This is such an important topic, and I'm happy to see so many people really interested in seeing how trafficking affects boys and men. In this case in particular, I think will kind of open your eyes to different ways that it may involve boys and men. I have a distinct pleasure of working with Special Investigator Josh Kalis. He's the lead investigator on this case. And the reason that I know about this case is because someone said to me, hey, have you heard about this case? It's really cool. And I went and basically ingratiated myself with Josh and some of his colleagues to interview them and ended up co-authoring an article with one of the assistant attorney generals from that office. And when that article came out, very gratefully, people were interested and wanted to know more. And so we developed this presentation, and I forced Josh to come on the road with me and share it. I think there's so many really wonderful takeaways. So we're gonna kind of go through it and look at basically this case through a lens of labor trafficking, but we're really looking at forced criminality. So we'll see how that turns out as we go through. So thanks for the lovely introduction, Nathan. I am an attorney advisor with Equitas. I mentioned how many people were from Florida. I know you and I have that in common, Nathan. I started my career as a prosecutor at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office. My background was initially handling misdemeanor domestic violence cases and sort of worked my way through that office. It was a really humbling place to start, brand new, kind of like baby prosecutor, wide-eyed, thinking I was going to, save the world. and quickly learned that when we're dealing with cases where people know each other, where there is a continual contact, that they get really complicated. And we have to sometimes redefine what justice looks like, redefine how we calculate success, gearing towards more victim-centered approaches of let's focus on the victim's safety, emotional and physical, privacy, autonomy, those types of things. So that served me really well when years later, after having gone through the office and was trying homicides and kidnappings and sexual assault cases, the first, sort of human trafficking case landed on my desk in pure random rotation, as this life sometimes does for us. And it landed on my desk. It said sex trafficking. And I was like, what is this? This is way back in 2010. Luckily, I had a really aggressive, interested, passionate, empathetic detective who she and I just sort of built the plane as we went. And then the consciousness of everyone really started thinking about human trafficking. It's not new, but we had just not looked at it through that lens. Catherine Fernandez Rundle, the state attorney in Miami, heard about this. It just hit her heartstrings because she was really innovative in responses to domestic violence. And we saw a lot of those similar dynamics really early. So luckily under her leadership, we started a sort of casual task force, a more formal task force, and eventually a standalone human trafficking unit in Miami. And I was lucky to try most of Florida's first human trafficking cases on a state level. That included sex trafficking, labor trafficking, buyers, cases that were built purely on digital evidence. We were charged with being creative and aggressive. And so hopefully those lessons learned served me well as an attorney advisor with Equitas, where my role really is to support the field. And we're funded through various federal grants to and private grants as well, to take these lessons and make sure those of you out there doing this work every day aren't having to reinvent the wheel and you've got a place to go for support. So that's a very long-winded introduction of who I am and why I'm here. But really it's just to guide the conversation and bring to life. Well, Josh is going to bring it to life, but he's going to share a lot about this case. And so Josh, I don't know if you can give them a little introduction more than your title. I know he works some undercover, so you're not going to see him on camera, but if you could let folks know a little bit of your background.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, my name's Josh Kalis, and I'm a special agent for the Utah Attorney General's office. I am currently assigned to our human trafficking task force. We're also legislatively mandated to investigate trafficking in the state of Utah, along with investigating other major felony crimes. A little background on our task force. In 2009, the Utah legislature had some funding available, and they decided to create a state task force which would combat major felony crimes in our state, dealing with directly related to illegal immigration as well as human trafficking. So we are statutorily mandated to investigate trafficking. We take it seriously here. We have an aggressive attorney general who is a big proponent and someone who's very dedicated to the mission of eradicating human trafficking in our state. And so we are able to dedicate a lot of resources. We collaborate with other local agencies within Utah, most of them within the Salt Lake Valley, but we do work statewide. We've worked with St. George Police, which is near Las Vegas, all the way up north of our state. And we collaborate with federal partners as well. We work with HSI and Immigration and Customs. And so since 2009, we've been able to be very effective as a task force and investigating these crimes, which are definitely occurring in our state and everywhere. As you guys are all aware, these types of cases are hidden in our communities. And you'll see in this case study how an individual was able to traffic young boys for about a 10-year period that he was living and residing in Salt Lake City, Utah. I've been a law enforcement officer for 17 years. I'm actually from Maryland originally. I did see some people from Maryland in here in the DC area. I grew up about 25 miles from DC in Southern Maryland, and I began my law enforcement career with the Greenbelt Police Department in Prince George's County, Maryland.
Thanks. So this is Equitas. Check us out online. Again, we strive to be innovative, for example, like bringing this case to you guys all informed by the latest research, informed by survivors, and also practical. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some strategies that you may be able to almost, immediately apply to the work that you do. So check us out, because we do have a lot of trainings online, resources online. We're available for one-on-one consultations, and we're involved in a lot of partnerships and initiatives. Really proud of the work over the years that we've done with Nathan, but also things like the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, the Enhanced Collaborative Model Human Trafficking Task Forces. There are about 50 of those across the country, one in South Florida. Utah has one. Florida has actually quite a few, since I know a lot of you guys are from Florida. I tend to be Florida centric, although now I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. But lots of opportunities for us, again, to support your work. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank the work of the former Assistant Attorney General, Gregory Forbash. He was the lead prosecutor on this case, as well as thank the Utah Attorney General's Office's Victim Services Department. That was led by their lead coordinator, Tammy Atkins. They coordinated with community-based NGOs as well. One of the primary NGOs they worked with was the Refugee and Immigrant Center and the Asian Association of Utah. Also want to help reach out and thank James Blanche, Judge James Blanche. You'll see as we talk about this story that he continued the sort of trauma-informed approach into his courtroom. And so want to make sure we give a shout out to all those folks. So hopefully through this case study, you'll be able to better recognize and describe methods used by traffickers in this sort of forced criminality. You'll see a lot of similarities. We'll often bring comparisons with child sexual abuse and grooming, but also gangs and more traditional sex trafficking, labor trafficking dynamics that you may be familiar with. We'll talk about how this investigation and others can be more trauma informed, leading to better outcomes to hold offenders accountable, especially where male victims are being abused and exploited. It may have to, look at these things a little bit differently, while also understanding the commonalities and not minimizing the harm caused to boys and men through this exploitation. And the collaboration, obviously key, that'll be woven through everything that we talk about today. So the grounding premise of all trafficking and exploitation is this intersection between vulnerability and exploitation. So when we're looking to identify victims of trafficking, we should be looking at who amongst us and within our communities is most vulnerable. That's probably a better red flag than some things that you see about trying to identify one particular case of trafficking, looking for a tattoo or something like that. Really, if you want to get to the heart of trafficking, we're really looking at addressing underlying vulnerabilities. So in cases of trafficking, whether it be sex trafficking, labor trafficking, forced criminality, what are some of those vulnerabilities that you'd see? And think about it maybe in the terms of boys and young men and forced criminality and labor trafficking. Curious if you guys want to just put them in the chat. I'm sure we've seen a lot of them before. but we're looking at, poverty and maybe immigration status. Great. LGBTQI status, that's in the chat. Thank you. Unstable home lives. Lack of education or job opportunities. When we think about labor trafficking, I feel like that's a really predominant one that we see. You combine that with immigration status, pressure from peers. Yeah, that peer pressure makes one recognize what they don't have oftentimes. And anytime you're looking at somebody that doesn't have what they need, you're going to have somebody that's very vulnerable. You could also see folks with physical or developmental or mental disabilities, homeless, right? Racism, and that goes part and parcel with colonialism, with some of our immigration policies. It continues to sort of compound some vulnerabilities that are there. So great, and I think Josh will agree that this sort of looks like what we saw, what we're going to see in the Victor Rax case. Another one that I think in the Victor Rax case became perhaps particularly prominent was the fact that many of the young boys lived in homes where there wasn't a father figure in the home. Social media, ACE events, love it, guys. You guys are on top of it. So before we get into the details of the Rax case, I wanted to point out some of the things that I like to talk about when I look at trafficking cases. And from the prosecutor's point of view, I'm always trying to figure out, how am I going to get the jury to understand this? How am I going to focus the jury's attention on the offender, right? What did the offender do? We want to make sure, I want to make sure as a prosecutor that they're seeing the offender as somebody that's predatory, that's seeking out vulnerable individuals and exploiting them. Because a defense attorney is going to be really good at sort of trying to put the spotlight on victims that may come forward at the time of a trial that have trauma, substance use disorders, and criminal histories, right? So the defense's plan is always to be, no, look over there at those victims. Don't look at my client. So to focus it on the defendant, a great way to do that is really think about the perfect plan that this defendant had. This defendant sought out somebody that was vulnerable, somebody that they could have access to, and somebody that they thought nobody would believe, or that they thought would never go to the police, or basically that they thought they could get away with. So the perfect plan in almost any trafficking case, you're going to see these three things. You're going to see vulnerability, accessibility, and perceived lack of credibility. And that's one of those things that we can sort of flip the script on, because an offender is hoping that we fall into that trap and don't believe their victims. They're hoping that the victims think they won't believe and won't come forward. So we can do a better job on that piece of making sure that we believe and look beyond, and you'll see how important that was in this case, to find victims credible and to believe them and to follow through with investigations. So just to make sure you have the reference point, this is the labor trafficking statute. I'm using federal definitions, and I'm sort of putting it out into this analysis of act, means, or purpose. We often see all of these acts. It looks a little bit different. Sex trafficking has a few other acts like solicit and advertise. You don't see that in labor trafficking. The purpose is forced labor, for services, or debt bondage. And the means, while we do still colloquially say force, fraud, and coercion, when we talk about any trafficking, force, fraud, and coercion, it's a lot easier to say than this. But just to put a pin on it, the criminal federal definition does not include fraud, although fraud is often a part of coercion. So it just looks a little bit different. Wanted to point that out. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that there's some really great case law out there that illegal labor and services also fall under this purpose. It does not need to be legal labor or legal services. So we see labor trafficking through forced criminality in a couple of different ways. This case is going to be, we're going to be looking at drug distribution, but I'm curious if any of you in the chat have seen forced criminality in a different way. What other sorts of things are they under labor trafficking? Obviously, sex trafficking, we're talking about prostitution. With labor trafficking, we've seen some forced criminality in some other areas as well. Great, Catherine. Organized shoplifting, panhandling. If panhandling is illegal, absolutely. Traffic through gangs for further like gang activity, which might include, I don't know, robberies. We've seen some car thefts. What else have you guys seen? So when in a sex trafficking situation, you see the forced criminality of them recruiting other girls. So other underage workers. So that's not necessarily illegal work, but I see where you're going with that. Working with false documents. That's a great one. Gang initiation, drugging men and stealing watches, drug sales. We've also seen it in the illicit cannabis growing industry. There you go. Cynthia's got that. In Toronto. You know what? We had some folks, Josh and I presented this live last week, and we had somebody else from Canada who was talking about carjackings and some things involving trucking industry. Okay, you guys have got it. You guys have got it. Okay, so don't, sometimes judges will be like, wait a second, this is illegal. They can't possibly be trafficked through this illegal labor. Want to make sure that that myth or misconception is not out there anymore. Then I want to break down what coercion means. And now you may be working in a state and looking at your state definitions, but most state and federal and international law sort of mirrors this concept. So I'm going to use the federal, but hopefully it will inform you through whatever statute you're looking at and trying to analyze. So coercion is defined as the threats of serious harm or physical restraint. I think we all get that one, right? That's the easy one that we're looking at. The middle one is the sort of really broad, all-encompassing. If you can articulate it, you can get it in here, which is any scheme, plan, or pattern. As long as it's intended to cause the person to believe that if they don't do this act, they don't perform this labor or service, it would result in serious harm or physical restraint. So that really gives us a lot to work with. We can really articulate many different ways that the scheme, pattern, or plan was devised by the offender. And the third one is the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. So I'm curious, a lot of times we see, oh, that's especially in labor trafficking, where a lot of victims of labor trafficking are foreign nationals. We'll see this as threats of deportation, but it's more broad than that. It can also be threats of arrest. It can be threats of eviction, taking your family away. And this could be a threat. Any of this could be to a third party, right? So the abuse or threatened abuse of legal process could be, I can get your brother arrested back in Honduras because I have friends that are police in Honduras. Or you have to do this because I'm going to threaten your family. So that third party is legally proper there. I saw that kind of coming in through the chats, which I'm trying to monitor. But if you have something specific I don't cover, please do put that in the Q&A so it doesn't get lost. So now I want to kind of go back to this idea of serious harm, because that's included in the first one and the second one, right? Something that will result in serious harm. So if I read that and I didn't know any better, I would be thinking of like broken bones or some sort of physical harm. But the definition actually tells us very, very clearly that it's any harm, whether it's physical or non-physical, physiological, financial, reputational, that is sufficiently serious. So any of those harms, I think we forget, especially the financial piece. Labor trafficking you're often going to have some form of debt bondage. Somebody's going to have put up a house for collateral. And so financial harm is real. Reputational harm as well. Sometimes that plays into us having a better understanding of somebody's culture or what that reputational harm might look like. So I'd be curious what you guys might think could impact reputational harm. What kind of tactics would fall under this reputational harm? So feel free to keep that going in the chat. Okay, so any of these harms, as long as it's sufficiently serious, under all the surrounding circumstances, to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue to perform this labor or services. So we've got some folks talking about that reputation, and you're thinking about who somebody might be. So you're thinking of a politician or a coach or a teacher. If they were to be trafficked, this could ruin their reputation. Yes. What we've been seeing a lot is, Elena, you're kind of getting there, is the taking photos, taking videos, and then sort of almost extorting the victim. Hey, if you ever tell anyone what's going on, I'm going to send these pictures to your mom, or your whole family is going to know what you've been up to. That, again, with the cultural religious background, that can come into really strong harm for that reputation. So when we talk about all the surrounding circumstances, the same background in the same circumstance, this really tells us that even though, for you lawyers out here, even though technically this is what we call a reasonable person standard, which is like we don't look at Jane specifically, we're supposed to be looking at this reasonable person. But then it goes on to say, yes, it's a reasonable person, this sort of neutral person, but it's this person with all the same surrounding circumstances, this person with the same background as our victim. So what this tells us, the law tells us we have to figure out who our victim is. What are their vulnerabilities? What are their circumstances? Because traffickers make very individualized plans, right? So they're going to push the buttons that work for that victim. And a trafficker may have several victims and push different buttons for all the victims. Or they may pick sort of the same type of victim and keep using the same strategies, which is what we see in Victor Rax. But we're supposed to be taking an individualized approach here, and that's what I wanted to impress upon you. So we're going to get into it, and I want to start off by saying, Josh, there are many places where this case would have gone unnoticed for much longer than it ever did. The fact that your office had this culture of being aggressive, of being willing to see things in a different light, really made a difference. So what do you think were the biggest keys to success from like the starting point that allowed you to recognize this and to move forward in a way that was really trauma informed?
Yeah, the keys to success for us were just building a task force that, collaborates with numerous different partners, not just law enforcement officers, but victim service providers. And, a lot of us, some of our agents have actually gone out and on their own cultivated those sources in the community. We've tracked down non-government entities in our state that are, helping victims of domestic violence or human trafficking. And we found that a lot of the people that were running those organizations and helping victims of human trafficking didn't really have a great impression of law enforcement themselves. In fact, some of them had been former victims and current survivors of trafficking themselves, which is why they are involved in this type of work to begin with. And so they've had negative experiences with law enforcement. So us going out and meeting them and building those partnerships, it was huge because they realized that, man, these guys do get it. They are vested in this type of work. They understand that, the victims of human trafficking, they understand what their needs and everything. And it was building those partnerships that has allowed us to be successful, and it generates cases for us that we wouldn't have probably gotten onto prior.
Yeah, and I think that's a takeaway I would give to folks that maybe are thinking about how do we investigate these cases, because that, cultivating CIs, cultivating people within those communities, that's something that looks a lot more like a gang investigator or a drug investigator, where they're like on the streets trying to cultivate that kind of relationship. And we don't necessarily think that as much when we think about trafficking. So sort of pull in and leverage those skill sets from other types of investigations, I think really served you very well in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, this case was started by a confidential informant that we had cultivated years prior, who had provided me with intel on other cases, and that literally called out of the blue and said, "Hey, you need to look into this guy, Victor Rax. He's a big drug dealer." And that's how this case came forward initially.
Yeah. And then these cases are resource intensive. This particular case, you found dozens and dozens of victims eventually. And, if you're working in an office or with supervisors that want quick resolutions to cases, that could be problematic. So to have someone that set, a supervisor, an office, a culture that says, you know what, do this the right way, take your time, make sure that we're thinking about victim safety when we go forward. I think that was also something that allowed you to really step back and be strategic with your operation planning and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get into it. This is Victor Rax, and we'll walk through sort of his perfect plan, his toolbox of trafficking, step by step. And Josh will sort of flush out some of the details for us. The first one being step one, identify those vulnerable individuals. So who did Victor Rax sort of target in this case?
Yeah, so Victor Rax was very methodical about choosing his victims. He chose victims all within the same demographic. They all looked similar. He was a serial pedophile and a serial rapist of juvenile boys, all Hispanic boys in the Salt Lake area, between the ages of 9 and 15 years old. Our youngest victim was 9, and at the time of his arrest, he had a 16-year-old victim with him that had been with him since 12. Most of these kids were, all of them were living in the more poor area of Salt Lake City, Glendale area. Most of them were undocumented, or at least their parents were undocumented. Jane mentioned earlier, most of them did not have father figures. I think that was something that Rax paid attention to and definitely honed in on.
And these were fairly high crime neighborhoods where there was some gang activity in the neighborhood that everybody was sort of aware of, right?
Yeah, so Rax, on top of being a pedophile and serial rapist, he was a drug dealer, and he was connected to a cartel, Mexican drug cartel, that we believe he was a part of, that had historically been recruiting Honduran juveniles to distribute narcotics for that organization. And then Rax was taking that a step further, where his main goal and interest was to gain access to these young boys so that he could sexually assault them, which is what he did for about a 10-year period that we believe. Through my investigation, I determined he had been in Utah, we believe, since 2004. And this case, we did this case in early 2014 was when the confidential informant had tipped me off to this case. And he literally called and said, "Hey, this is something you need to look into. Victor Rax, he's a Guatemalan drug dealer, big time. But every time I see him, he's got a juvenile boy with him, and it's during school hours, and something's just off." And something's not right.
Yeah.
But the CI just had a hunch on that portion of it.
So the next step two, and again, those of you, I see some in the chat, we're talking about your experience with like child sexual abuse and this grooming, but this idea of having to gain access and gain accessibility. And Victor Rax sort of used this position in the community. He was well known, right? And he was sort of thought of as a good guy to not only the boys, but their families as well.
Right. So in the picture there, you see that him holding the money up, that is what Rax did to entice all of the victims in this case. He would approach them on the street. He would strike up a conversation in Spanish with them, tell them that, they could call him Tio, which is uncle in Spanish, and that he was basically like the uncle of this neighborhood and takes care of people. And he would pull a wad of cash out like that, and he would say, "Have you ever seen this much money?" These kids are like, "No, never seen that much money before." And he'd say, "Well, this can be yours. All you got to do is hang out with me. That's all you got to do." And he was very methodical with that grooming, where he would hang out with these boys for 3 months to 6 months, even at times, before any sexual assaults occurred. And during those months of hanging out, he was paying them. So he would pay them $100, $50 every time they hung out. And he would tell them to tell their mother or their parents that they were making this money in his landscaping business. And then he would follow up with the parent and say, "Your son's a really hard worker. He's a good kid, blah, blah, blah." And, he would basically build a rapport with the victim's parents even. And then, once he had that trust with these kids is when the sexual assaults would begin.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to remember that grooming, that accessibility, that was not only to the boys, but their families were involved as well. Krista is in the chat mirroring my thoughts, which it was the trust with the victims and the trust with their families. So when they were off with Rax, the families weren't thinking something's bad's happening. They're thinking, "Oh, this is good for him." Like they're working for the landscape business and teaching him how to work and what, work ethic is and that type of thing. Right.
Right. And so what in all reality, what was really happening is he was roping them into the drug culture as well. So they would be out observing him doing drug transactions. He would then turn them into drug dealers, which is that forced criminality that we speak of, where they would be waiting in a parking lot to do a drug deal. He would give the narcotics to the victim, to the boy, and say, "This one's on you. When the guy in that blue car comes over, you're going to hand this to him. He's going to hand you some money." And slowly he starts roping them into this criminal activity, and then now these kids are dealing drugs and learning this lifestyle. He would fist bump them that, "Hey, good job on that, you did good," and then he would break them off a little piece of the money again, say, "This is yours, good work," and again make sure that you're telling your family that you made this money working for my landscaping business.
So I put in here the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure many of you have seen this, or maybe even just have intuitively know what this is, but it's basically telling us what we as human beings need in our lives. From the very beginning at the bottom, we need air, water, food, shelter, right? And then we need to be safe. We need to have personal security, and we need to feel like we have resources to keep ourselves safe. And then as we move up the hierarchy, we have needs for things like friendship and love and intimacy, family and connection. and then ultimately also status and recognition and respect and esteem. And then at the peak of our pyramid here of needs is the idea to become what the most we can be. So traffickers will basically see what is the need. Okay, what is the need of this vulnerable person that I've identified? And then they're going to try to give them that need, or at least pretend that they're giving them that need. So when somebody is, homeless, then it's really easy. They need a place to, see shelter. But once they have shelter, they still have ongoing needs. And so even if a trafficker gives them the shelter, then they're going to perhaps, well, now you need, you need to feel safe. I can be the one that can keep you safe. You don't have, a father figure at home. You need a sense of belonging. You need this connection with a male figure. I can give you that under love and belonging. So there's this sort of hierarchy of needs that traffickers either intuit, or sometimes they actually have this. But this is really a good demonstrative to think about how sometimes trafficking and traffickers think. Because I think, Josh, you were saying you've actually found this on somebody's phone.
Yeah, so we have a case where we put a pimp in prison here. He's currently incarcerated, serving a 20-year sentence. But he was a classic trafficking case of exploiting female sex workers and trafficking them. But he actually had Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid, on his phone. He also had a book, Pimping 101, that referred to this in there. He actually referred to this and used it, studied it. I mean, he had it on his phone, and he actually conversed back and forth with other people regarding this, of how to fill in these needs for the victims.
Yeah. So the initiation, and now we're sort of talking the language that you might hear with gangs, the sort of initiation phase. In this case, Victor Rax sort of pivoted from nice, generous guy in the neighborhood helping out the young kids to now an abuser. And you mentioned sort of crossing some of those lines. And I think one of the first lines was, asking them to lie to their parents about where they're getting the money, which is like a little, probably seemingly little white lie. I don't know if so much of a white lie, but we're not talking about what eventually the lines that he was asking them to cross.
Right. Yeah, it was little by little, but initially was providing them with drugs and alcohol. When they hung out, he would take them up to lava hot springs, which are these hot springs up in Idaho. Take them camping, where he would provide them with drugs and alcohol, and sexually assault them during those trips.
And then the forced drug sales that came from that. And that's really where we're talking about the forced criminality. The labor trafficking begins at this point.
Correct. And, including forcing them to sell drugs, he would then use the boys to recruit other victims. So it would be like, well, tell your friends, they can make money too. And that's how he ended up recruiting additional victims, was through the current ones that he was exploiting.
And that leads to really complex responses from the victims, survivors, right? Because I'm imagining at some point there's some feelings of complicity. And right. So that all of that together, the vulnerability, and then crossing these lines, whether it be drug dealing or whether it be recruiting, it heightens the vulnerability and makes them be able to be exploited even more easily. Right. By Rax or even others.
Right. A lot of these victims felt indebted. It was very sad, when we were interviewing the victims at the end of this case and building the trafficking component to this case, rounding up all the victims and doing CJC interviews. Something that stood out to me during those interviews was, independently of each other, all these kids were saying the same thing, that, you know, he'd been taking care of me and, you know, providing money for me and my family. And so when that stuff started happening, I just knew that nothing in life was free, and I had to, this was time to pay up. And I guess this was what I had to do to pay that debt. And that was really sad to hear those victims say that. And a lot of these victims didn't realize that that the other boys were also being sexually assaulted, because that's not something that they were discussing amongst each other. So they knew that they were all, you know, dealing drugs and doing all that stuff. But a lot of these kids in the interviews were asking that same question, if they were the only ones that had been occurring to.
And so the next step 5, is really Rax having to maintain control. I think we've got a preview of some of those tactics, but I was wondering if you could share some of the other things that Rax did to keep the victims in fear and keep them, you know, basically under his control.
Yeah. So in addition to all the other stuff Rax was doing, he also used this cultural psychological abuse, where, you know, he's from the Mayan region of Guatemala. He's a Mayan Indian. He spoke a dialect there, one of the Mayan dialects, which was Kepchi is what it's called. In addition to Spanish, he spoke Kepchi, and he had these shrines, Santa Muerte shrines. He had the Jesus Malverde, which is the patron saint for drug narcotics and supposedly protects drug traffickers. The Santa Muerte is the patron saint death, kind of a creepy looking thing there. He actually had one of these shrines in his bedroom with the names of some of the victims in the hand of the shrine. He would pray to this statue in the dialect, so the kids couldn't understand, which freaked them out. A lot of these kids are from Mexico. Most of the victims were from Mexico or Honduras or El Salvador. So they were superstitious and believed in this. And he would tell them that the gods wouldn't protect them if they didn't continue to go along with this abuse and everything. So in addition to threatening them with deportation or deporting their family or having them arrested, which he did, he told these victims, "I'll turn you in. You're a drug dealer now. You know, I'll turn you in." And some of these kids were getting arrested in the school for drug distribution, and Rax was showing up to their court hearings pretending to be their father, just to keep his thumb over them even more. So I mean, it really made these kids feel like they had nowhere to go, no one to talk to, and that they wouldn't be believed because, number one, they're being arrested and charged with a crime, and the very guy that's been doing all this to them is sitting there in the courtroom and nobody's asking any questions.
So this is the power and control wheel. Someone put in, Melanie put in the chat a link to the Biederman's chart of coercion. Similarly, these are wonderful demonstrative tools to think about offender tactics and why offenders use particular tactics to continue to assert power and control, assert coercive control. I highly recommend all of these, Maslow's pyramid, this wheel, the Biederman's chart. They're all great ways they can guide interviews so that you can ask some questions. And they also help inform ourselves about what are these tactics and inform juries down the line as well. I put up the power and control wheel here as a demonstrative because it specifically talks about how sexual abuse is used to assert power and control in furtherance of trafficking. So when people hear about this case study, one of the a common question that we'll get is, isn't this also sex trafficking? And I don't know if anyone wants to put in the chat. Ultimately, this was not sex trafficking, and I'm wondering if folks can maybe, you're all very, I can already tell you guys are really up on top of this.
Somebody already hit it with the no commercial.
There you go.
There.
Samantha wins. Yeah. So there wasn't a commercial aspect to the sexual abuse. And like Josh says, Rax's primary goal here was to gain access and sexually abuse young men. So it almost like the sexual abuse came first, and that the trafficking was incidental. But you can also see it as sexual abuse was a furtherance of the trafficking here. Adam's got it too. Look at, got a lot of people in the room. I know you can't see all the details on this. If anyone needs access to it, you can obviously Google it. I'm happy to give a handout as well. But I just wanted to note that sexual abuse is a tactic of the trafficking and not in and of itself sex trafficking. Okay, so the last tool in his tool belt was, as a trafficker, as an abuser, as somebody that is exploiting others, they want to escape accountability, right? So what is Victor Rax's, strategies to escape accountability? Well, first off, he thought he could get away with this. And one of the biggest reasons was
he had.
Yeah.
He'd gotten away with this for about 10 years in Salt Lake. Something we didn't bring up earlier, but when I was initially turned on to this case by the informant and did a little research, I looked into our report management system, which is used by most of the agencies in Utah, including Salt Lake City Police, which is the jurisdiction that Rax was residing in. I found a police report from 4 years prior, where a Honduran juvenile, 16 years old, had turned himself in on a drug distribution warrant. He told the detective that the reason he was turning himself in was that he needed to escape the situation that he was in. He said that I'm being sexually abused by Rax. He's not my father, and my real family's in Honduras, and I just want to go home, and I'm not the only one, is what he said to this detective. And ultimately, this kid did not want to cooperate or provide a statement or anything. He just wanted to get out of the situation, and he was deported back then 4 years prior. So once I read that, I knew we definitely, that's what really confirmed that, there was a trafficking case going on. I mean, the kid said he was being forced to distribute narcotics for him, being sexually assaulted and threatened with arrest and deportation, and then ultimately just wanted to go home. And I learned through my investigation that when that kid had turned himself in, Rax actually had other victims trying to locate him because he wanted to kill him. He's like, I got to find this kid. And he actually, three or four of the victims felt really bad that they had actually gone out and looked for that kid, but that's what Rax had told him to do. And, Rax took a lot of precaution during that time. For over a year, he moved from his home and stayed in a camper trailer on the back of his friend's property. He owned a Mexican market downtown, and he lived in a trailer for over a year just to avoid law enforcement being able to follow up with that initial investigation. And so then fast forward 4 years is when my informant called me about this case.
And I think, that's a takeaway, and you don't want to be overly Monday morning quarterbacking or looking back and thinking, what should have happened. But I know when I first started doing trafficking cases, one of the best things that I ever did was I would pull the criminal histories of any victim, any defendant, any witness, and not just look at, sort of a rap sheet, but actually pull the files, pull the reports. And what looked like, an offender that has, no trafficking history, but they always seem to have like domestic violence cases or some other cases that I would pull the actual reports from years in the back, and I'd be like, oh, well, this is clear as day trafficking. If I had that lens, 5 years ago, somebody probably would have done something different with this case. But to go back and do that historical investigation and pull any records you can find, whether they be criminal records or sometimes civil protection order records, things that come in looking more like domestic violence or family. So for here, you've got that CI, you've got very little information, but as soon as you pulled the history and actually looked at that case, it was like, boom, this is what's going on.
Yep.
And kind of, I can't help but think, it's a shame that nothing was done at that point. But as you mentioned, that young man or that boy really just wanted to get home and leave. Right.
And the other thing was that the Salt Lake wouldn't have been able to locate him because he was hiding out. And during that time that he was hiding out, he continued to traffic and do everything that he had been doing. He just did it from that other location. And he had actually kidnapped two of the boys. Two of the victims' parents had reported them missing because he had taken them up to Lava Hot Springs in Idaho, and then had them staying in the camper trailer as well. But none of that had been connected at that time.
So I'm going to ask this to the folks in the chat. How do you think, if you came across these boys, how do you think most people would view them, the victims in this case? Gabby, as criminals, gang members. Yeah. Thanks, An, for sharing some additional one. Criminals, gang members. Yeah. I use and I think actually I loved Nathan put out one of the sort of advertisements for this webinar. It was sort of like gangbanger or victim of human trafficking, right? So delinquents, illegal. Yeah. So you guys, I think this is why I think more than anything, this case captured my curiosity. Was like, how was Utah set up? How was Josh and his office set up so that they saw it through a different lens, right? So I think we've talked about just the culture of the office, the CI development, Josh's amazing experience and expertise and empathy. But I could just see this would be so easily just kind of gone through the cracks. So I know Josh is a really humble man, so he won't say anything like that, but we'll go to the next one, which is, okay, so now you've got your information, you've got sort of this idea of what's happening. How did you decide to sort of move forward with this case? What was the strategy? And I know you worked with the prosecutors when you did that as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have the collaborative model that you mentioned earlier. The nice thing about our office too is that we're kind of in-house with our prosecutors. Most law enforcement, you investigate your case, you very rarely interact with the prosecutor, and then you're going over to the DA's office to screen it, or maybe you're just screening it in person or via email even. In our office, our prosecutors are housed with us, and as part of our task force, we have dedicated prosecutors that only prosecute human trafficking, and they don't prosecute any other crimes in the office. There are prosecutors dedicated to our task force and to our team, so that allows us to collaborate a lot better. I was the case agent on this case, but I had a lot of help from other investigators in the unit, and we would sit down and plan and strategize. And part of that planning, was with the prosecutor, but most of it was with investigators and thinking outside the box, and knowing that we had a drug dealer, but he was a serial rapist, and we believed that he was raping current victims that were juveniles. So that was really hard to strategize, because it's like, you know, we didn't want to allow that to be happening and occurring, knowing that was happening, and that was, you know, that was something that was hard to stomach and hard to deal with, because we were out conducting pretty much almost 24-hour surveillance on him once we knew what this case was and how big it was, and the implications of it. We pretty much dropped everything else we were doing, and our unit dedicated the next 3 to 4 months of our time and efforts into this case. And it took a lot of resources. It took a lot of dedication, and everybody was dedicated to the mission and stopping this guy from what he was doing. And we wanted to make sure that we did it, and, you know, didn't do something, make a move too early to where we wouldn't be able to hold him accountable for it and mess up the investigation. So the strategy was at this point to just build a solid drug distribution case on him, get him on what we could get him on, get him away from the victims, get him incarcerated, and you get him on an immigration hold, because we knew that he was, you know, we work closely with our ICE and HSI partners. We knew that he was here illegally and been deported previously. So we, you know, built this as a drug case initially, where we had UCs introed in that were buying directly from him. We were identifying his suppliers and everybody that was involved in the drug distribution portion of the case. And then with the intent to get him in jail on an immigration hold where he couldn't bond out, and then, you know, follow up with all the victims and get them into services, get them interviewed, and start building the trafficking portion of that case on the back end. And that strategy worked out well in this case. It's a strategy that we still use today on current trafficking cases. I can't think of most of not our labor trafficking cases so much, but all of our sex trafficking cases here have a drug component.
So first off, I wanted to mention that not only did you put an ICE hold on him, but Greg, the prosecutor in the case, also objected to him being deported. And that's something that I ran into when I was prosecuting labor trafficking cases in Miami, is that I would have foreign national offenders be arrested. We'd have an ICE hold, but they would want to self-deport, and they would almost like allow themselves to be deported prior to me being able to prosecute the case. And that happened quite often because it was hard to kind of make sure one system knew about what the other system was doing. But Greg did a great job because he proactively objected to ICE being able to deport him before this case was handled. And I think that was important because, Josh, you shared with me earlier that some of the victims had said, okay, you've arrested him, he'll just get deported and he'll just come back.
Right.
And so almost wanted to make sure he wasn't deported at this point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was unique, and I haven't really seen that before, but that was something that we did in this case as an extra precaution to make sure that he didn't slip through the cracks and basically, get handed over to immigration prior to answering for the state charges that we had against him.
I'm wondering if you can share at this point a little bit about the adult victim and your identifying and then working with him.
Yeah, so about 2 months into this investigation, a separate individual came forward. He was an adult, probably in his upper 50s. He was an adult victim that was also being trafficked by Rax. In addition to his two sons were victims, but he himself was also a victim. He was from Guatemala. He had been approached and befriended by Rax. They were both from Guatemala, so it was easy for him to build rapport with this victim. And He basically turned him into a meth addict and kept providing him with meth and holding that over his head. So the same way he did with the juveniles. He would threaten to have them deported, have their sons deported. He threatened to kill them, threatened to burn their house down while they were sleeping. And he would take that up a step and actually leave a physical gas can at their house in the morning. So when they were walking out, they're like, oh, there's a gas can. And what was interesting was that Rax had actually committed an arson with a person inside of the house, and was actually listed as a beneficiary on an insurance policy for an arson that he did. The guy was able to escape. Salt Lake Fire did a great job of responding and getting this guy out of the house before it burned down. But these victims were all aware of this. So him saying he was going to burn their house down, they knew he was capable of it. But those were the kind of thing, the psychological things, that threats and everything that he would do. And Jane and I have talked about this. With trafficking, people automatically think of people being chained up physically, and in reality, we see people chained up with invisible chains of all this trauma and psychological abuse and threats and everything. This guy didn't know where to go. He finally was fed up with it and was like, I'm either gonna die. Like I can't keep doing this and witnessing what I'm seeing. And so he went to somewhere in the community, and he didn't really know where to go other than some Hispanic leader in the community. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he went to that person and told him the story of what was happening. And that person happened to know our attorney general, who had just recently became the new attorney general, and reached out to him and was like, hey, I got this guy in the community, in the Hispanic communities, claiming he's got this guy that's being trafficked with him and his kids. And long story short, I was called in by my chief on a Friday evening to meet with this guy, which I did. And he was thrilled to learn that we were already on to Rax and that we were already investigating him. And he kind of broke this case wide open for us because of his close proximity to him. We were able to wire him up. We were able to get undercovers introduced in through him, and he really helped us get him. When I met with him, I basically was like, yeah, I want to get this guy. I know what he's doing, and can you help me get him? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll help you and do anything you need me to do. And he was very crucial in building this case against Rax and building additional cases. That's the crazy thing. This case was done in 2014, and I'm still working informants that were cultivated out of this case to this day, including that victim.
Didn't you just get in the car with him and drive around?
Yeah, so this guy is the one that once we had arrested Rax, this guy basically got in my car, sat in the back with tinted windows, and we drove around Glendale with him pointing out victims. So he would, because again, these are victims that I don't think would ever have come forward. The only one I know that ever came forward was that 16-year-old Honduran that turned himself in 4 years prior. And so these kids were, these were victims that were deeply ashamed of what had happened to them, and just scared to death. And they were, probably going to keep this dark secret of what was happening to themselves. And, if it wasn't for this adult victim pointing out where these victims lived, we would never have been able to find as many as we did. But he drove me around, and I mean, we're talking 20 plus houses. He's telling me there's a victim there. I think, his name is so-and-so. A lot of times he'd only have a first name for the victim, and I would just write down the address. And once we had him in custody and on the ICE hold, we then followed up, just old school knock and talk, just knocking the door and finding the kid and saying, hey, introducing ourselves and saying, hey, we've got this investigation and we think that you might have some knowledge about Victor Rax, he's in jail right now with an ICE hold, and we just want to talk to you. And every single one of those did agree to, once they were sought out. I don't think they would have come forward on their own, but once they were sought out by us and they felt safe that he was in jail and didn't have access to them, they ultimately agreed to come do interviews with us.
Yeah, really quite impressive. And as someone said in the chat, Mary, that necessity of a little bit of self-control, I can't imagine how difficult that was, but doing it right put you in that position to have victims that felt safe enough to come forward and could tell, like, you really care, you want to do this the right way, you're investigating this very thoroughly. And so all of that comes to bear when it ultimately you're having to take those, what I imagine are very difficult statements to take.
Right.
So someone had asked in the Q&A about, what did we do? What do we do with the victims of this type of criminal activity? And I think the primary one is, treat the victims as victims and walk that walk.
Yeah, someone's asking, were the victims deported? Absolutely not. And all of the victims that we located in our investigation were roped in with our victim services and provided, as you see there in the slide, safe harbor. There were, I can't remember how, there was a handful of these victims that also had drug distribution warrants and other misdemeanor and a few felony crimes that were related to, that were, crimes that they had gotten charged with while they were victims of Rax. And we were able to get all of those charges dismissed. We did reach out to the DAs and the local prosecutors and explain the situation, and not only got those charges completely dropped, but we were able to get immigration status for all these victims. So the ones who were undocumented received T and U visas that were applied for through our office in HSI.
Yeah.
And given continued presence, which Jane will go over here in a minute.
Yeah, and I love, Josh and I presented this once we had the honor of Sean Reyes, the Attorney General, presenting with us. And I added this to the slide because he talked about how he recognized that there were 20, 30 victims, whatever that number ultimately came forward, but he recognized that this case in Victor Rax impacted probably hundreds of victims because he's also counting their families as being victims. So that sort of like wider lens of what this victimization and what the ripple effects of this exploitation was. And I think that's really important as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of a segue and start talking about T visas and U visas because it's so important, as you guys have pointed out, with you do all this work, and if your victims don't have immigration relief available to them, it's really for naught. So I'll very quickly go over the T visa and the continued presence, which are both specific to victims of human trafficking. The U visa is collaterally related and often comes in as well, but I'm not going to touch upon that. I will say that Equitas does a ton of work in this field, training prosecutors how to deal with this at trial, whatnot. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information, but please follow up with me. T visas, there's 5,000 T visas that are allowed per year. This is created by USCIS and basically is meant to protect victims of severe forms of human trafficking. Severe forms is not some extra requirement, it's the federal definition. So that's the TVPA, the federal definition of trafficking.
Any victim of trafficking can be awarded a T visa. We've been able to apply for these on numerous other cases as well.
Yeah, and USCIS is the United States Citizen and Immigration Service. I'm
Yeah,
gonna say, Veronica.
Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Yeah. So if a victim applies for and receives a T visa that allows them to reside within the United States for 4 years, so it's a temporary form of immigration relief. It does come with employment authorization and derivative T visas for certain relatives. So in this case, like parents, siblings, children, depending on the age of the victim. And there's also possibility of this status being adjusted to permanent residency after 3 years of having the visa. During all these steps, there's a lot of fail-safes in place where USCIS is reviewing the applications, going through the background, doing biometrics and all of that. But law enforcement plays a really important part, is almost like a gatekeeper to sort of sign off and say, hey, USCIS, I have reasonable suspicion, that's the standard, that this is a victim of human trafficking. And our legislature put this in place for really good reasons. They consider it a tool for law enforcement. This is so that law enforcement can have better relationships with these communities that they're trying to serve, that more people will feel comfortable to report crimes, that you'll have stable victims to help with investigations and prosecutions. So this is really the goal of T visas. The applicant has to prove that they meet this federal definition. They also have to respond to reasonable requests for collaboration, and they have to prove a hardship upon return to the home country. Usually all of that is really done by advocates, by immigration attorneys. And so from Josh's perspective, prosecutor's perspective, it's really just some initial paperwork that needs to be done. I will say that a T visa can be applied for without law enforcement. It's an uphill battle in that case. So we recommend law enforcement to sign what's called an endorsement or a declaration. Sometimes this requirement for cooperation can be waived at the discretion of USCIS. Again, that's a high level of proof to show that there's some really serious physical or psychological trauma that makes them unable to participate. And that requires them to provide proactively an affirmative statement and oftentimes some medical evidence as well. So this is the brand new law enforcement guide that came out, I want to say in at least the last year. There's the link here. You guys will have access to these slides. If not through Nathan, you can always reach out to me as well. I'm happy to provide them lots of follow-up information about the details of this. So T visas, from application to receipt of the visa, is somewhere around 12 to 14 months right now. That's my latest information. That review process is getting shorter and shorter after years of it getting longer and longer. So that's a little bit of good news, but it's still quite a lengthy process. So in the meantime, there's something called continued presence. And this is almost an immediate form of temporary immigration relief that victims can receive almost upon identification as a victim. The best case scenario I'm hearing is that they can get this within 20 days. Pretty amazing. But this is something that federal law enforcement has to sign off on. And so if you're not yourself federal law enforcement or federal, like U.S. attorney, you have to have partners that you can go through. So Josh, are you like a TFO for HSI or something like that?
Yeah, so we partner with them and TFO. Yeah, it HSI has to bless off on it, so we just get with our local HSI guys, and it's not a big deal. I mean, I think cops sometimes get worried about signing off on something like this. If these are true victims in a case, they deserve to have this continued presence or visas to be here. That's why this program was designed in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Josh. Please tell everyone you know that, because I think it is scary as far as signing off on this paperwork. So continued presence allows a victim upon identification to have legal status for 2 years. It can be renewed if the case is ongoing. It does not guarantee any form of long-term immigration relief, And it can and should be revoked should, for example, your investigation leads to the fact that this person is not in fact a victim. And that again is one of those fail safes in place so that people feel more comfortable doing it very early in the investigation. The point is, identify someone, give them this sort of safety. It protects them from immigration. It allows them work authorization, certain benefits. And so as these investigations are lengthy, all of a sudden you have a stable victim. You have somebody that is able to work legally, which we know is a huge motivator. And the cooperation is required to access the benefits related to it. And that's through a separate sort of chain, the Department of Health and Human Services. So we've got some immigration on the immigration attorney in the chat. I love it. Life changing. Absolutely. Everyone that actually uses these tools as they were designed to be used will tell you it's such a game changer to working with victims of trafficking, labor trafficking specifically, because you're more likely to have foreign nationals. So this is the overall process, identifying the victim, getting continued presence or CP in order, getting that right away. And that kind of serves as a stopgap while you're working on the T visa documentation. So you get the endorsement from law enforcement for the T visa, advocate or immigration attorney is putting together everything for that T visa application, all the supporting documents, all of that goes to USCIS. And there's then a decision from USCIS. I think this slide is outdated because it says typical length 6 months. I'm going to say it's much more like 12 to 18 months right now. But so that's just a quick overview of T visas and continued presence. Obviously, when our offender, in this case, Rax, one of his greatest tools that he used in his tool belt was threat of deportation. You and your mom are going to get deported. If you can help, meet that with, no, here's some safety, here's some immigration relief.
A lot of the victims in this case, sorry to cut you off, a lot of the victims weren't even aware that Rax himself was undocumented and had been deported numerous times. So Rax, in addition to threatening that having them deported, would tell them that he was a U.S. citizen. And so a lot of the victims didn't even realize until we arrested him, and we were able to tell them, well, no, he's not a U.S. citizen, and in fact, he's on an immigration hold right now and can't bond out of jail. That was something that was kind of helped empower them to provide us with statements of what was going on and everything.
Yeah, because didn't he offer to adopt that adult victim's children to make them citizens or something like that?
Yeah, so early on, when he befriended the adult trafficking victim in this, he exploited his ignorance of the laws here in the U.S. and basically was telling him a bunch of BS about how the state will come and take his kids away, and he's a U.S. citizen, so he needs to give his kids over to him to adopt them so that he could protect them, is what he had told this. But we all know what his true intentions were with trying to have this guy give his kids up for adoption to Rax. And fortunately, this guy was ultimately smart enough to not do that. But that was something that Rax actually tried to do.
So after all of this amazing work, this may not be all of the charges. I think I got most of them here. But as you can see, this is what he was ultimately charged with under Utah state trafficking statutes and other statutes. So we've got the aggravated human trafficking, and then the sexual abuse was charged separately. The drug charges, the possession with intent to distribute, the pattern of unlawful activity. So that's like a racketeering or an organized crime type of charge. Endangerment of a child, 22 charges of that. And then also this tampering with a witness charge. And another plug, in trafficking cases, you should be assuming that tampering is happening. This sort of nature of an offender is to escape accountability. And so they're going to continue to use these tactics well beyond, an arrest. So Josh, can you tell them a little bit about the tampering charge and how that came about?
Yeah, so for all the cops and investigators, detectives out there, you guys know how important monitoring jail phone calls are. And we tend to do that with all of our trafficking cases, especially, but I do it as much as I can on cases because it's unbelievable how much these suspects will talk in jail phone calls, even knowing that they're being recorded. And it's probably a roll of the dice that they're taking, that we're not going to follow up with that we're not going to take the time to monitor and listen to jail phone calls. We did do that in this case, which was beneficial because we were able to bring even additional charges once he was incarcerated, and that was witness tampering. He was reaching out to his brother. We were able to charge his brother as well with obstruction of justice and witness tampering. And he thought he was crafty because he spoke a dialect that very few people on earth speak and can understand. And he did do that witness tampering from jail in the dialect with his brother, instructing his brother to track down witnesses, not have them tell them to not testify or it will go bad for them, and things like that. And that's how we were able to bring those charges. And that required a lot of additional work and resources of monitoring these jail phone calls, and then tracking down the only person I could find in the state of Utah that did speak that dialect. Happened to be a college professor that spoke that dialect and was able to transcribe those jail phone calls for us, which resulted in those charges.
You don't want to tell that story about how you got him to help you?
Do we have time?
Probably not. But needless to say, there was some transfer through earbud to earbud of, do you understand what this guy is saying? And all he could originally hear was the word to kill. And so you followed up on that pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. So once I found this guy that could actually speak the language, I just had him on the phone, and I held up earbuds to the phone and was like, can you tell me what this dialect is? And he's like, yeah, that's Kepchi. He's like, I teach Quiche, which is another Mayan dialect, but I do speak that one. And he says, yeah, the only thing, he's like, it's kind of muffled, I'd have to hear this in person. And he says, but I can hear him. He said the verb to kill is kind of the only thing I picked up there. And I'm like, well, I'm coming down to meet with you right now. And he's like, well, I've got college classes I got to teach. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, you're the only person that speaks this language, and I have reason to believe this guy's, trying to harm some of my witnesses. And I did drive down there and had him listen to that initial jail phone call, which enabled us to go back and do further investigation and arrest the brother and put these additional charges.
That's just like another takeaway. When we talk about language access, and sometimes getting, when we're working with cases that involve languages that are not maybe like Spanish, French, or things that are more common, is going to universities. They'll often have, international students, language departments.
Right.
So that was really brilliant of you. Okay, so the big reveal. So I'll let you guys read this, but Victor Rax, after the amended indictment was filed, or superseding indictment, killed himself prior to any preliminary hearing. So the trauma-informed response didn't end, though. So your office and those that you partnered with continue, and to this day, continue to provide services and support to victims. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring out was that, typically when a defendant dies, the case is just kind of dismissed pro forma. But that didn't really sit well with the folks involved in this case, including Gregory Furbash, who was the prosecutor. So what they did is they arranged for the defense to file a motion to dismiss and then ask the court to hold a hearing on that motion. There was nothing other than that those charges were ultimately going to be dismissed as they were. But that creative thinking of trying to create a place where the victims could be present and provide victim impact statements, I think was really thoughtful, empathetic, all of those things. And I don't think I've ever seen that happen before, Josh. And I don't know if you were involved in the decision making on this particular piece of it.
Yeah, that's what makes this case so interesting. It's just one of those other things that I haven't seen since this case, and that was where we gave the shout out to Judge Blanche early on. He's a great judge. He's still a judge here in Salt Lake, and he was very empathetic, and I thought it was really awesome that he allowed the victims to still kind of get this off their chest, I guess is the best way to describe it. They were, by this time that Rax had taken his life, a lot of these victims had been empowered and emboldened and had gotten their life back through victim services and everything, and wanted to get closure, and that part of that closure would have been testifying against him. And most of these victims were in a position to where they wanted to have their day in court, and they did want to testify against him and hold him accountable. And he was looking at numerous 25 to life in prison with those charges. And so the judge did something very unique and allowed some of these victims that wanted to bring that closure, even though he was no longer here, and we could essentially no longer charge him, right? Because he wasn't here anymore. He still allowed them to have a court hearing to where they could kind of get that closure that they deserved.
Yep. So we do have two of the victim impact statements that we'll share with you. I'm going to, I want to be accessible, so I'm going to try to read them, but I do choke up. So forgive me, because years out of the courtroom, I've now become able to cry again. So, honorable judge and whoever this may concern, the actions of this horrible human being, Victor Rax, has turned my life upside down and inside out. I don't even know who I was. I have never feared anyone in my life like him. I was unable to sleep, eat, or even breathe. He broke my family apart and forcibly abused me and the other children in other ways. This has put my life and me through so many emotional and fearful impacts. People like him should burn in hell. I pray and hope there aren't other people like him in this world. And the second one is, I just wanted to say a few words. Victor Rax took my dignity. He took my confidence. He took myself. I don't know who I was, and it was impacted me very much in my life negatively. And I'm trying to get my life together right now. I just want to say thank you guys for being there. For law enforcement, this is where it gets me. That stopped him, and right now this is making me feel better to let this out. So I think we can all agree, amazing job on this case, and so many things to take away from it as we worked through it. I want to share that this is a link to the article. If you want to share that with anyone else, you can find that online. But overall, we're hoping that, through hearing more about this case, maybe we can analyze gang cases through this trafficking lens, and look at these grooming and coercive tactics that can be part of labor trafficking as well through the forced criminality. And then make sure that we provide immunity for forced criminality and those other, immigration relief if that's necessary as well. So I will put the link in the article back. I think I left us about 10 minutes for questions. You're going to all have the slides, that's Josh and my contact information, but let me see if I can get the link to the article to actually just go into the chat. It'll take me a second, so I want to make sure we open it up to questions. And while we do that, Nathan, if you don't mind monitoring maybe a little bit, I'll work on getting that link into the chat.
Sure, absolutely. We actually had a question for Josh. Actually, it's how do and Liz is asking this: how often do police agencies work with private agencies specializing in OSINT investigations, i.e., to close the gaps expeditiously? We find we're working in silos where identifiers are missed in various industries like banking, insurance, or retail.
Yeah, it's a great question. Not sure if I can fully address it. There's a lot of shortcomings, I'm sure, still out there with law enforcement and bridging the gap with our partners that are outside of law enforcement. It's something that our office strives to overcome, and I think we've done a good job. But that's part of our education when we go out with our law enforcement partners. It's up to all of us to just have that open discussion and training to get everybody on board to collaborate together, because obviously we're way more effective when we're all on the same page on this stuff and when we're all working together, because these cases take everybody's resources. It takes a huge team effort, and we wouldn't be able to have the success that we do with not only this case, but all of our ongoing trafficking investigations that we have currently. We rely heavily upon our partners outside of law enforcement to take care of our victims, and just all the different programs that are available to victims in these types of cases.
Thank you. There were two other questions in the QA. Two of them refer to the UNT visas and I believe the CP. And then the second is actually with regard to the victims, asking in regards to drug dependence, especially when drugs are used for coercion to remain in this vicious cycle. What types of services did they receive, or what types of services are available?
So again, there's a lot of services available in our state for that. In our cases that are similar to this, including this one, we definitely got victims into those services who needed them. The ones who wanted those services, they were provided with that. We've worked with partners here to get some of our victims that are drug dependent into very, very good rehabs. One in Hawaii. We've sent victims as far as Hawaii and other states into really good drug treatment programs so that they could get clean and ultimately come back to their families and here in Utah and be in a better position to testify in those cases. And we'll do that whether the victim wants to cooperate with the criminal investigation or not. We've had victims that initially weren't in a position to be a victim and to be a cooperating victim and to testify. They weren't in a position to be able to do that until they received that treatment. And we've had victims that have been in treatment programs for 4 or 5 months, 6 months, and then they're like, hey, you know what? Now I want to meet with those guys again, and I do want to go after my trafficker, and I want to cooperate and provide a statement and testify. So that's something that we strive to do with all of our victims.
Did you go ahead, Jane?
I was just going to say, if you're working in a jurisdiction, one of the key things to start doing is mapping out services that are available to you. So that's why the partnership with victim services is so key, is because as law enforcement, as prosecutors, we aren't in a position to know what's all available out there. So partnering with victim services, having victim services have access to other, networks like this. So if somebody does want to maybe return home, or it makes sense to have them outside of your jurisdiction receiving services, you can connect. Your HSI, your local HSI offices, they usually, I think, always have a victim advocate working, and they are a wealth of information about what's out there available, and they're very generous with sharing that. So if you want to be like, hey, I need this service, maybe that's a place to go if you can't find it elsewhere. It's like tap into folks that are doing this in other agencies.
Thank you, Jane. We have a few minutes. Did you want to address the questions in the QA about the CP?
I'm happy to. When I got myself kicked off, it cleared all my history of Q&A, so I can't read it.
Gotcha. So the first is the process. So if the process takes so many months, you had mentioned 12 to 18 months, is the victim protected from deportation during that process?
So that's one of the key things about continued presence. So continued presence is almost immediate. So as the T visa process is taking longer, you want to get CP in place. And so that's one of the things. And the other thing I'd say is same with the U visa, as soon as somebody applies, there's literally a red flag that goes into the system. So if anyone were to encounter that victim and look them up, like ICE, look them up, it's going to show that they have a pending application based on their victimization. So they should be, there should be a protection from deportation while that is pending. It puts also, though, you have to recognize that puts victims in a really precarious nature, because while they may have been way under the radar, nobody knew they were in the United States, as soon as they apply, they have to provide all of this information. So it's a very scary time for victims when their application is being processed. And so if you can do something like CP, you want to do that in collaboration with the application for the T visa.
Great. Thank you very much. And I believe that was it. The other question in the chat was so to the derivative, if it was extended or for the parents of the victims.
Yeah, if the child is under 21, the parent can receive derivative status.
Excellent. And we have about 1 minute. I want to personally thank you both for your willingness to share this information. Agent Kalis, no words. I can just tell you that your willingness to share what you've learned and share information about this case will undoubtedly impact many of our responses, if not all. Jane, I really appreciated how you always appreciate your collaboration, the way you candidly and transparently are able to tell that story and to lead the conversation is it's really important. It's always a pleasure. To remind everyone, I will email, there'll be a follow-up email to all attendees. That follow-up email will include a link to the slides, the link to the recording, and your certificate. It usually takes about 2 weeks, so 10 to 14 days for the results to come in and for me to send those out. If you do have any questions, I placed my contact information, my email into the chat. And I believe that's it. Agent Kalis or Jane, did you have anything else?
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss this case. It's an important case for our state, and I'm sure these types of cases are out there all over.
Yep. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for putting on this series. I really appreciate it, and I've been enjoying it so far. So,
all right, absolutely. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, guys.